Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next event. I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, consistent with our values of community and diversity. We have a responsibility to honor and make visible the university's relationship to Indigenous peoples. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the enormous suffering that COVID-19 has unleashed amongst our friends and family in India and South Asia. Our hearts go out to all those who have suffered loss and who are continuing to navigate this extremely difficult time. Today's webinar is part of the Center for South Asia Arts and Justice series. This webinar has been supported by the Kohler grant from Stanford Global Studies, and it explores how arts can illuminate injustice in the society and urges us to envision new horizons of justice in South Asia. I'd like to thank the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies, the Stanford Center for Human Rights and International Justice, and Berkeley Institute for South Asia Studies for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to thank my amazing team, Lalita du Perron and Simrat Mathru, for putting this together. We've explored this question in relation to visual art, music, documentary, poetry, and today we're going to examine the genre of graphic novels in this talk by Professor Mukherjee and bring to the question, how we can imagine popular histories in the region. This talk does contain references to sexual violence and may be triggering for some, so we have added some resources and phone numbers of helplines in the chat. So let me introduce our speaker for today. We're delighted to welcome Professor Nayanika Mookherjee. She's someone I've known for a very long time, since our graduate days in JNU in New Delhi. She's a professor of political anthropology at Durham University. Her research concerns an ethnographic exploration of public memories of violent pasts and aesthetic practices of reparative futures. She explores this through debates and engagement with gendered violence and conflicts, memorialization, and transnational adoption. Based on her book, this excellent book, Spectral Wound, Sexual Violence, Public Memories, and the Bangladesh War of 1971. She co-authored with a Bangladeshi visual artist, Majmoon Nahar Kea, a survivor-led guideline, graphic novel, and animation film, Birangona, towards ethical testimonies of sexual violence during conflict in Bangla and English, which received the 2019 Praxis Award from the Association of Professional Anthropologists. She has published extensively on anthropology of violence, ethics, and aesthetics. Currently, she is working on her manuscript, Arts of Irreconciliation, and as a British Academy Fellow is continuing her research on 1971, war babies, and transnational adoption. The title of her talk today is Traitors of Justice and Graphic Ethnography. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nayanika Mookherjee.
Thank you, Jisha, Professor Menon, as well as Lalita du Perron and Simrat for walking me through this and inviting me in the first place. And it's a particular pleasure to be here and to be hosted by Professor Menon. And as we said, we go back a long way and I have a long friendship. And also thank you for all the kind of emails and technical stuff. And I'm really pleased to be here. But also in some ways, I just realized it right now, looking at the first poem I'm going to start with, is resonant with some of the scenes we have been seeing in India and Delhi. I start with a poem by Rudra Muhammad Shahidullah, a Bangladeshi poet, which he wrote in 1992. Here he says, even today, I get the smell of corpses in the air. Even today, I see death's naked dance. Even in my drowsiness, I hear the desperate scream of the rape woman. Has this country forgotten those nightmares, those bloody times? Independence, that is my family, found by losing all my other dearest ones. Independence, that is a priceless harvest bought with the blood of my dearest people. My rape sister's sari is the bloody flag. Shoidula's evocative poem, The Smell of Corpses in the Air, written in 1992, articulates a disillusion with the achievements of independent Bangladesh. At the same time, he hopes for a better future and seeks to resurrect the purest form of independence from the wreckage of dreams. In this wreck, the uncanny horrors of the rape of 1971 is embodied and aestheticized in the bloody national flag. The piece of cloth which stands in for the new nation of Bangladesh is for the poet the bloody sari of the rape sister of the Bangladesh war, or the rape sister's sari can only emerge as the bloodied flag, standing in for the irreconciled injustices of the war of 1971 in Bangladesh. So thinking about arts and justice, in some ways, the work of justice attempts at the most basic level to recognize the past historical wrong and to offer redress and reparation. Its goals are to construct a more just future for the individual or group who suffered the injustice and to start a new future for society as a whole. But as we know, the instruments of justice can also also have negative consequences. And in some ways, the graphic novel is in response to those interventions of justice seeking, and in a way to think through what the various ramifications of justice really are. In this context, the role of arts or aesthetics and the relationship with justice and nation, we know for the nation, it needs to be performed, it needs to be materialized to various aesthetic artifacts. And these artistic and aesthetic artifacts have not only served as tool of education, indoctrination, and enculturation, they also embody moralizing, introspective, and also possibly cathartic possibilities. Aesthetics may involve visual and auditory sensory experiences, perception, and imagination, which may either be pleasant or disturbing. Aesthetics may also include a personal experience of peculiar emotion, what appear to be very private feelings about an object or practice. They are, however, always dependent on, to a certain extent, psychological dispositions of anxieties, politics, class, desire, values, and knowledge, which all contribute to the conditions under which one experiences the aesthetic object. Aesthetics are thus intrinsically linked to ideology. So on one hand, we find the commodification of art and aesthetic practices aiming to socialize people. At the same time, it has become the site of political and social dissent, a space of resistance to injustice and violence as well. In this respect, art and aesthetic practices generate politics by other means. And here for me in this presentation, how the graphic ethnography generates this politics by other means is what I'm trying to explore through the figure of the idea of the traitor and the traitor's relationship to justice. And also in this case, the traitor here is primarily to think through the figure of the raped woman and her child, the Boer baby, as a traitor. But before I go to that, I want to kind of share my screen just to kind of pull up a PowerPoint, which I meant to pull up earlier. And I just go there. Okay. So this is, I will talk about this cover image maybe later, but this is a site, memorial, Rayar Bajar in Dhaka, which was a site of mass grave, where bodies of around 50 intellectuals were found on just after 14 December 1971. And the Rayar Bajar Memorial, I've written about it extensively, but the broken wall is supposed to stand in also for the kind of questions that independence has not addressed itself. But here also I have the engagement with an aesthetic object of that of the nation is also a place of romance itself for a couple. So as in setting up the work, as Jisha said, it draws from my work, my book, Spectral Wound, which I actually launched at the center for the first time when the book came out in, I think, November 2015, when Thomas Blom-Hansen had chaired that session. And so it's really nice to come back and talk about the graphic novel and subsequent work actually, which draws out and follows on from Spectral Wound itself. And drawing from Spectral Wound, then we, we have developed this, this graphic novel developed by myself and Najmun Naharkia in Bangla and English, which is available online to be viewed, for everyone. It is an open access work. And this was also made part of Royal Anthropological Institute's Illustrating Anthropology. So there's a growing trend in looking at how anthropological ethnographic work can be done through illustrations itself. We managed to actually use then the slides of the graphic novel into an animation film. This is no Persepolis or Studio Ghibli, but we are really glad we did it in terms of being able to translate using just the slides of the graphic novel into an animation film, which I will show a small clip of. So the graphic novel and animation film are similar, though the different kind of formatting has enabled me to take it to different kinds of audiences, and including many of the survivors have seen the film. They actually have seen the film more than the graphic novel, because I think there's an thing about moving image versus a still image. And so there's a different way, different formats that generate different kind of audience and spectatorship itself. So here, one of the things before I move on to talking more about the context of Bangladesh, I'm not talking about what led to the 1971 war, which all of you in the South Asia Center would know in terms of the breakdown between West Pakistan and East Pakistan after the partition of India, and then leading to the Bangladesh War of 1971. And at the end of the war, we find the official and contested numbers. So this is really important to think. I'm referring to the numbers. I'm not saying this is the number this is my agreed upon number, but this is the official and contested number are 3 million dead and 200,000 women raped. And these include women raped from across all backgrounds, across all classes, across all religions, indigenous women as well. So and obviously, so overall Bengali women were at one level targeted for the context of the Bangladesh war itself. And my location, obviously, I'm very conscious of doing this work as an Indian from Kolkata. So I'm Bengali, so I share the cultural and the linguistic heritage, but I'm also very conscious about doing it as an Indian in Bangladesh, and in terms of the various geopolitical connotations that has. But also it generated for me what Amitav Ghosh has written in Shadow Lines as the looking glass border between Kolkata and Dhaka, and between Bangladesh and West Bengal itself, and the connections we've had itself. What was striking for me in doing this work in Bangladesh, and why I call it public memories, is that 6 days after the war, the Bangladesh government referred to women who were raped by the Pakistani army and their local collaborators, referred to them as Birangonas, referred to as primarily as heroic women. And it has various connotations, which I've described at length in the book. But also what was interesting and important to note is this was an attempt by the government to address any prejudicial feelings towards these women. And also there was a logistical issue. The number of women who were raped were huge in numbers. But till date, this intervention by the government of referring to women who've been raped, giving them a heroic epitaph, and I know there are legitimately critical readings of that kind of name giving, but at the same time, this has remained unprecedented in any instance of sexual violence till date. So that is I think really important to keep in mind, while the criticism of the term Birangona can be kept in mind. And this was done by Kamruzzaman in December 1971 as part of the interim government itself. And, and along with this announcement, what was striking for me in going to Bangladesh and the public memory that is prevalent, and I want to show a few images to kind of give you the sense of the scale of the public memory of the Birangana or the rape woman itself, is there exists a huge visual and literary realm on the figure of the rape woman throughout the period from 1971 till now. And it exists primarily in this visual realm of what I refer to as the face genre, as well as the body. So there's a whole set of images which um, are fall within these categories. But also there is the famous, very in a symbolic genre, there is that of the what is called as the famous the Uchule Chobi, or that hair photograph by Naimuddin Ahmed. This photograph has been iconic in various, and it has been read in various ways. Again, I talk about this photograph extensively, and I was very lucky to be able to go and interview the photographers. And the context of image making and the various ways these images are read among different groups of audience was also very important for me to look at. And this image is often seen by some as standing in for shame and anonymity, whereas for the photographer, the clenched hands were a sign of resistance as well. Also, the figure of the rape woman emerges in that of in films. This is Bobita in Orunodar Ognichakki, Witness and Pledge to a New Dawn, which comes out in 1972. She's dressed in a shirt and a luki given by a liberation fighter or another man, and as a recovery of the sign of the rape woman. And then we have also advertisements here. This is an advertisement of Ogroni Bank coming out in Genocide issue 1972, talking about violated Shamoli, and her mute sobs want to say never again, no more genocide. And then we also have rickshaw drawings coming out, which are discontinued from mid-70s because the government feels there's too much attention being given to the rickshaw drawings itself. Or the images of sexual violence. So we also have various other advertisements, from biscuits to banks. You had the imagery of the rape woman prevalent, and as a way of presenting the public memory of wartime sexual violence. At the same time, while I was there, there were various women who were in the coming forward and talking about what had happened to them in the wartime in the 90s. And also there were various national mock trials as a form of the kind of what might be seen as transitional justice paradigms that were taking place, in which many of these women had gone and given testimonies. So this is happening in a mock fashion, not trying criminals directly, but there was often this attempt to try various collaborators who had sided with the Pakistani army. And this is obviously contested because there's also seen to be attack by liberation fighters on various communities who were deemed to be collaborators on the Bihari community. So there's various kind of nationalist, also black holes, which since 2000, many Bangladeshi filmmakers, writers have been writing about. So there is a dominant nationalist account, but also there are various black holes that the Bangladeshi community has also been addressing. But one of the things, so I worked with some women who had come out talking publicly, and one of the questions that was asked by me by the activist community was that they were surprised that they were with their husbands, and they were with the same husbands with whom they were when they were raped, and because often the understanding of the rape woman is through a wound, what I call the spectral wound, that either she is physically affected or she is socially outside any network of kinship and nurturance. So what I refer to is there's a prevalence of a horrific image of the war of the Birangana itself, and this horrific image also kind of generates a certain idea of who the Birangana is. And in this context, what became prevalent among working with many of the survivors was what they would refer to as Mala Itihash or Chorom Itihash, a lot of history, a severe history. And this they would talk about is, and this is where the kind of they would talk about how the very process of gathering their testimonies had been another set of transgression in terms of how what their experiences of giving testimonies were. And in some ways, the graphic novel and the book, rather than having an account of what happened in 1971, looks at how various activist circles and the testimonial culture that emerges in the light of the search for testimonies itself. And so here, in turning to the one of the first things that in being able to translate this graphic novel among many of the survivors, they would laugh about some of the things that are there and say, you also put that in there. You know, there's some funny, there's some also humorous insights of being together that also is part, and which are some of our favorite pages of both myself and Kia's, which is page 8, I think, in the graphic novel. But they said, we cried and laughed on reading this book and seeing the film. It should be read and seen by all children and the parents. By reading this book and seeing this film, children will not question the war again. No one will question who fought, and no one will ever give quota or scorn to the Viranganas. Along with the children, their parents would read, their mothers would read, and they would get to know about the war. All our stories are here in this book, and I want this book to be in every school in Bangladesh, so that all children know about us. So this, and there's a 4-minute clip, which I will come to it later on. But in some ways, what emerges from the graphic novel itself is that primarily the emergence of the need to address that there was no silence in terms of the public memory. Obviously, there was a silence around the testimonies of women themselves. But also to counter it is really important to counter the horrific embedded idea of the Birangana as some kind of horrific image, and also the need to talk about what was to focus on the post-conflict contexts of the war of the Biranganas rather than what happened to them in 1971. And this was really important to bring about the way in which, I'll just see what the next slide is. Yeah, so it was really important to bring about what we developed was a set of guidelines, which then went into a graphic novel and then the animation film. But also this was important because in Bangladesh, many of the women, their names are on a public gazette, and they are getting pensions from governments on the basis of that information being there. Also, what emerged as in the context of the Rohingya community, there were similar issues of transgression emerging among the Rohingya community by researchers going and asking them what happened to them. And so this emerged also in the context of the various kind of focus among the various governments looking at sexual violence during conflict, but they had no kind of guideline for researchers looking at this, how to carry out when people were willing to give testimonies, what the process of giving testimonies should be. And so only this year, the Murad Code has been launched, which uses the graphic novel and the guidelines that we developed. And it's a code based on Nadia Murad, who is a Yazidi survivor and the 2018 Nobel Prize winner. So, I also had collaboration with my colleagues in Research Initiatives Bangladesh, but also this is a trigger from a series of graphic ethnographies that is emerging within anthropology. University of Toronto Press has a graphic ethnography series itself. And also RAI's Illustrating Anthropology shows that in some ways graphic accounts could be a way of thinking through interesting ways of understanding some of, and I would talk about some of the examples soon as well. So the participants have been governmental and non-governmental organizations in the entire process of developing this graphic novel and the animation film, as well as, and it has led to various kind of changes in policy practice and ideas, but also we've had journalists, photographers being involved in the process, and and contributing to this entire process itself. So the story in the graphic novel is based around various archival, a story, it's an intergenerational a story between a grandmother, a grandchild, and the mother, and where the grandmother wakes up from a nightmare, or often has nightmares, and she wakes up from a nightmare, and Labon, her grandchild, is back from school, wants to talk to her about 71 because of a school project. And her mother, Henna, comes in, and they start talking about the way to carry out talking to survivors, which leads to the guidelines itself. But at the same time, so while the guidelines, there's a functional aspect to the graphic novel, there's also, one could use various archival photographs which couldn't pass the books, the publishers' art criteria, but one could include it in the graphic novel. And the graphic ethnography, actually, what is really important for me to highlight is the figure of the Birangona, or the war heroine, as a traitor while also being a heroine. And I would talk a little bit more of the traitor soon. But in terms of the very horrific accounts of the war heroines, I want to play here a clip to show how we need to think about beyond the horrific account of the war heroine, and think about the socialities of violence through which women have encountered this violence, and how they have lived through it without it being the accounts that we have seen earlier. And one of the really interesting other aspects that we could explore interestingly in the graphic novel are the role of objects. So the graphic novel opens with the grandmother's nightmare, but also the hand of a soldier on the door, and the sound of boots, which were often, very often, memories that people would be scared of, and has come up again and again in my work. That the fear of banging on the door, to the extent I've had friends telling me that in an exhibition, just a door was part of an art installation, precisely bringing back those fear, the memories of such fear itself. So the door, the various objects, we could explore various objects in ways which are effective and yet aesthetically generates for us that memory and that sensibility through which people went through 1971. Another interesting aspect is also before I show the clip, is the role of the subjectivity of various survivors. You will find there are various kinds of survivors. And one of the instances in which myself and Kia had a long discussion was about the subjectivity of the sex worker, whom we would talk about very briefly. And she is the only one in a veil. And Kia actually queried me and said, "Do you think she should be in a veil? She shouldn't be in a veil." And I was thinking, whenever I met her, she would always come in a veil, because that is how she met people. Her whole position of respectability is based around the idea of the veil, and how she negotiates, even while being a madam and she herself had grown up the ranks within the red light district itself. So I wanted to those were various aspects we could explore more within the graphic novel, which cannot really be it can be written, but the sensibilities and the aesthetics of it, I think, generates and comes out more within the graphic novel itself. So I'm going to stop sharing this briefly and open up the page of the film. So here I am trying to bring out various accounts of the war heroine, which goes beyond the account of the horrific account. And so here you will see 4 small accounts of 4 Virangonas and 1 slightly longer one.
I cannot hear you, Nayanika. Can somebody confirm?
Better?
Yeah, better. Thank you so much.
How long have I spoken, Lalita?
We're about half an hour in.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So one of the things that emerge in the graphic ethnography is also the role of silence and resilience. It's not just about speaking that generates the idea of resilience, but also we're talking about how the need to be silent is also important in terms of being resilient to this experience of violence. But also we show the post-conflict violence and also the continuum of violence and the socialities of violence, as you've shown here in some ways, the way Shireen can't keep a photograph of her husband, or Moina can't cut fish, a very gendered job that passes on to her husband. And also the role of embodied experiences through fragments. So in various instances, we are showing and talking about how women would be standing, watching, kind of talking about the weather and say, that day also I was in the middle of a storm like this. So the various external aspects of the women's lives also formed part of the way people would refer back to their experience of 1971 rather than a voyeuristic linear narrative itself. And more importantly, it was really important to bring out the context of silence, honor, shame, and stigma, which is often assumed to be a given experience of that of being of sexual violence. And instead, we are talking about the post-conflict context in which the political historical context within which these honor, shame, stigma is evoked. And it's not something inherent often that we see in a lot of literature in Muslim societies. So for example, one of the survivors who was being subjected to a lot of scorn would point out that how there were land problems with the person concerned, and hence they would use the instance of their being raped as a way of belittling her, as a way of putting her down, as a way of shutting her. So when these instances of honor, shame, and stigma are used, are what we need to kind of explore through ethnography, rather than taking them as an inherent and a given account of sexual violence itself. So so these are the accounts of Priyopashini and Morjina Khatun that we actually come across, who are referred to as collaborators. And here the idea of traitors becomes really intrinsic, because in some ways, even though she's given the title of being Birangona, there's an inherent idea of suspicion and rumor about the rape woman, precisely linked to where she might have been during the war, and about and how she looked during the war. So as we find in both Morjina and Firdausi's account, they had to leave cities, even though Firdausi had her partner with her. Morjina left even though she protected various women in her family, in the community, but she leaves after the war because she's getting picked up every night. So there's always this idea of suspicion, and that can be applied on the body of the war heroine. And here the idea of traitor I have drawn also, and I was part of a volume on treason edited by Toby Kelly and Sharika Tiranakama, which they show the relationship between treason and the fragile nature of nation states, and how it draws on intimate relationships. And in fact, the betrayal they show is a dark side of intimacy, and resonates with the constructions of Birangonas as traitors itself. So the idea of Birangonas traitors also emerges in various instances. And what we find here, Firdausi and Chaya and Morjina all fended for themselves during the war, and those who were dependent on them also in the immediate post-conflict world. And in fact, this becomes a code through which Birangonas are identified through the increasing number of single working women in the immediate aftermath of the war. In fact, not only were the moral boundaries of so-called failed patriarchies drawn in ways that excluded Birangonas, it also resonated that the more communities knew about Birangonas, the more they suspected them of being betrayers, betrayal of being, as Kelly and Taranagama said, as the ever-present side of intimacy itself. And within this, wrapped within this is while the nation brought back the women in huge numbers to the rehabilitation programs, so it had various manifestations, the children who were born were definitely not included within the nation state, and they were put up for adoption and sent off because they were often identified in the newspapers at the time with physically being different, with very so-called Pakistani characteristics of tallness, broadness, light eye color or lighter hair color, but also behaviorally they were referred to as snakes and hyenas who were seen to go against the state. And so there's also a very gendered construction of the war babies, primarily as the male war baby who is threatening and kind of threatening to the nation state itself. So here, the very moral, that lays a claim, the idea of, in fact, traitor lays a claim to the moral and political certainty, the fantasy of a full Bangladeshi identity in the face of wartime complicity of various communities. The emphasis on the need for justice also highlights the legitimate inheritance through which the nation's wound is to be kept alive. But this is also facilitated through the figure of the rape woman, the legitimate presence of the other, who has to be evoked for the institution of the legitimate inheritances of the loss and sorrow of 1971, which is foundational for the near 50-year-old Bangladeshi nationhood. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nainika.
Stop sharing there.
That would be, thank you so much. And I just want to let the audience know that we do have some phone numbers in the chat for helplines, both for the Stanford community and for the wider community. So if you are being triggered, this is intense, and I have some questions about that, but I'm going to start with audience questions, and those of you that are tuning in, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Nainika, Shahana Siddiqui is asking, she's thanking you, appreciating your work. The question is, while the graphic novel and other popular culture visual representations are critical in keeping the history and memories alive of the war crimes against women in Bangladesh, often these representations remain symbolic, almost a fetishization of the rapes. How do we move beyond symbols?
So depends on what the symbols are, I guess, and it would be interesting to hear examples of what kind of symbolic symbols you were referring to. But I think this has been my attempt within Spectral Wound and also within the graphic novel in a way to show that this is where I refer to the socialities of violence becomes really important. It's not to say that women do not feel what had happened to them, obviously, but we need to go beyond the horrificness through which it is described and has often become commonplace, to the extent we can draw the continuum of violence to the recent, even as Shreoti Shabur has said, that in spite of various documentation by women's rights organizations about the issue of sexual violence in Bangladesh, what gets attention is the video that gets shared last October of the attack on the woman in Noakhali. And this is where, because the image of the horror really resonates in identifying with the experience of sexual violence. And I think we need to go beyond that to kind of really bring about what women are going through. It's not, I'm not saying they're not going through the horror of it, but they're also engaging with the horror in various kinds of ways. So for me, as Moina would say, there was this pole in front of her, the one that she holds on and says, Jan debo to man debo, and I'll give my honor, but not my life. That she's saying actually, and she would say, I've forgotten about this, but actually this pole doesn't make me forget it. So also memory is coming from around, it's not just embodied within the body, but it also exists in objects and aesthetics and artifacts, which is outside the body. And it's important to engage in the way in which we ourselves and survivors themselves engage with that, rather than through this symbolic, horrific accounts.
Do you feel, I often feel that rape as a method of, as a tool of war, or as something that's used in war, being classified as a war crime, it was seen as a great achievement when that was formalized, but it does feel like it then takes away from the personalness of that experience, almost like collateral damage.
I mean, it was really absolutely important that it was, you know, that it is seen to be as a war crime, because otherwise it's seen as a natural part of war.
Right.
So, so that it's important to decenter that naturalization. But at the same time, as we know, the naturalization of wartime rape is not new. It's always been used as propaganda by various instances of communities. For me, my learning of this instance was the 1992 attack on Ayodhya and the inter-community sexual violence that one heard under curfew. And also, it's never been talked about. It's always been talked about. And in fact, what is not talked about is male sexual violence, because it actually attacks the idea of heteronormativity, which is kind of basic to the idea of the nation state, and demasculinizes. So it's male sexual violence that never gets talked about. It's easier to talk about by nation states, by the powers to be, about the rape of women, whereas rape of men is much less talked about.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering about that. We have a question from Tajreen Midat. Thank you for a riveting talk. Could you please talk about the children born out of rape? Where did the state send them for adoption?
The children born of rape, so there was, the state had the rehabilitation program, and as part of the rehabilitation program, the women who came through that process, and also the children who were born through that process, there was one that, and also that I also want to emphasize there were various kinds of practical kinships in which families, kind of absorbed a child who would have been born and would have never talked about what happened or the instance of the birth. It's absorbed. So there were various kind of practical kinships also going on. In terms of the children who went through the state adoption process, they were predominantly sent to North America and Europe. And so I have been working with many of these, not all war babies, but many of these adult adoptees who are there in North America and all across Europe. And so international adoption continued in Bangladesh for a decade, and it was stopped in 1981. But many of the adoptees who are in different countries, who are in their late 40s, in fact, 50, late 40s, would be not necessarily all war babies. So that's where, primarily it went to North America and Europe. But as well as practical kinship, I want to emphasize that it was not, so people who did not come through the process of the government setup did absorb. But also what is really interesting is the role of social workers and doctors in this. And various social workers would say that they wanted to protect women from the emotions of motherhood. So this is a really powerful thing to say. So we had to try and protect women from the emotions of motherhood so that they don't get attached to the children and we can send the children off. So that's like real sovereign, a sovereign act to ensure the children are sent off. And this is where it's really important to add that the attempt of the state was to absorb the women because of, there was a logistical issue as well. The women were of huge numbers. So absorbing the women was part of the process of moving along the newly very bloodied, very, very ravaged country itself. But the children were definitely something. And it comes out very publicly in documents in the newspaper at the time of the children being referred to various ways within public documents.
Thank you so much. Elora Chowdhury is asking, they're curious to hear about your comments on the question of silence. Despite there being this vast literary filmic oeuvre around the Birangona question, why does silence continue to be such a powerful metaphor for representation? And they add, I'm thinking of the instrumental use of the images stroke narratives rather than an erasure and silencing of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have written at length and very, very critically about the idea of silence that seems to be very much prevalent as a way of understanding who the Birangana is. And it's a kind of I refer to the idea of silence and giving light and darkness, and we continue to see the kind of currency, the narrative that there was silence and that the figure of the Birangana is a horrific image. We continue to see the currency of it even till today's, various kind of artistic productions are still doing that. And it caters to an idea of what I refer to as narrative license, because you talk about silence and then you can actually shed light and bring out the Birangana account in a certain way, which again becomes horrific, but then you also give it narrative closure by saying you are the one giving it light and giving it voice and giving it to see the surface, come to the surface. So there is the erasure happens through the horrificness itself, but at the same time it's a authorship of the Birangana account, which then doesn't bring out what the women themselves are going through. And I'm not saying this has been happening. As I said, from the 2000s, there's been onwards, there's been some fantastic work and filmmakers actually bringing out much more very interesting accounts of Biranganas itself. And I would refer to Yasmin Kabir's Shadinota, Farzana Bobby's Bishkata, various other films that have come out on the survivors, which actually goes beyond this horrific genre itself. Tariq and Catherine Massoud's Women and War. So yeah, to name a few.
Thank you. We have a question from Paris Aurora, who is an incoming PhD student at Stanford's Anthropology Department. Welcome. Thank you for being here. The question is an interesting one. It's about creation. So I'm just going to read it out. It's quite long, so if you want to read along, it's in the open questions. I was wondering if the survivors could be thought of as not only creators of testimonies, but also of the graphic element of graphic ethnography. While their reaction to the novel and movie was extremely encouraging, are there ways in which they could have contributed artistically to the creation of the book and film, through perhaps drawing sessions where their choice of colors, objects, and human figures on paper could directly inform the graphic ethnography? And they give a little context. I'm trying to think of a similar methodological choices in my work with adults on the autism spectrum in India, where their voice is registered in the visual medium much more potently.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I consciously did not bring in the huge array of visual realm. I have never shown it to the survivors themselves, because I felt the very kind of horrific accounts that exists would be quite triggering for them. And often much of the conversations we would have among ourselves would not be about the war. It would be about what has happened to them after the war, or about a lot of other things. There was a lot of dark humor in our exchanges. And in fact, in Spectral Wound, I don't talk that much about what happened to them about the war. I have given smaller accounts of it here, but the discussions were more about their experiences of the testimonial culture itself. So at one level, I never showed them the visual representations, and I see what you mean by making them part, their direct contribution to the graphic novel and the film. It was kind of tricky to their children were part of it. Many of the sessions, in fact, many of the workshops, the children were part of it, because they now live in Dhaka, they now work in Dhaka, and it was easier to bring them in. And in fact, one of the occasions when we decided to ask, and this was the only time I've ever asked them, do you want to come over to Dhaka? Because I was there, and I said, come, why don't you come? So they came along in the village, but it became a hugely triggering experience for them, because it reminded them all the time they had come to Dhaka in the 90s and all that happened to them. They were meeting a minister of the Liberation War Affairs, all of that. So asking them to be part of the imagery was not something an option, but their children definitely were. The children definitely are. And actually, the page 8 is part of the experiences we ourselves have shared, and that's what they are saying. You know, you even included. There's a story about a goat that we had, and a joke about a goat, and there's a goat in one of the pictures, and so we were laughing, or the very fact that they would put oil in my hair because they were worried that my head was too hot because I did not add any oil to my hair. So they would sit and put oil in my hair, and we used that image in the. So there are some images of the fun times we had as well, which I would hope they would see it as part of their contribution. And so it wasn't possible to bring them directly in, but their children definitely were, and they have been in part of many of the workshops where all the other people I mentioned were also there.
Thank you so much. This is an important question, also quite long, so you may want to read along, and I'll make it live once I've read it out. From Sarah Hussein. I want to ask you about some other silence. Can you comment on how you see the contrast between the willingness of state agencies and partisan civil society groups coming forward to commemorate the past and now belated recognition of the Birangona, while remaining silent on sensational cases of contemporary rape, and particularly on the role of state agencies and ruling political groups? And also the failure of the state to prioritize addressing the discriminatory laws on rape, still allowing character evidence, for example, failing to take in the lessons of the Birangona. Does your graphic novel include or connect to any educational material that allows a discussion of these contemporary contradictions and impunity for contemporary human rights violations in Bangladesh?
I mean, Sarah, great, thanks for being here. It must be really early in the morning unless you're more close to me here. We've just written this piece this week in terms of connecting the Noakhali rape to that of 1998 Jahangirnagar University rape, where similar kind of complicity of state actors were very much there in terms of carrying out the sexual violence. You know, this is the issue. This is where Shohidullah's comes back in terms of, and the broken wall of Rayar Bajar comes back in terms of where at 50 years, many people are questioning where things are. Obviously, as you know, there is nothing in the educational material in Bangladesh. And in fact, in conversations with the Liberation War Affairs, I even said I would remove my name from the cover of the graphic novel if they would include it in the school curriculum, and just keep Kea's name because of the sensitivity around issues around religion, and because there was a bit of expunging of going on through the curriculum, as you know, within, and I could see that was a problematic issue, that my name was on the cover of the graphic novel with my explicit religious identity. And so I hope someday someone would include it within school curriculum in Bangladesh, because I think there are a lot of people who feel that it could become something important, interesting, in terms of even teaching methods of what not to do in ever thinking about carrying out an interview on any sensitive issue itself. To younger children and also to established activists as well.
We are coming towards time, and Sarah is saying they're looking forward to reading the new article to make the connections. Thank you for the response. So I'm just going to take one more question from Jaslin Kandari, who's thanking you and also asking you to please elaborate on how you use the comics form and compositional structures to create impact in constructing narratives through the multimodal form.
Can you say a bit more about the multimodal form in terms of being in different formats?
Jaslin, you'll have to type.
I can explain. One of the things when we were thinking of, so initially the attempt was to have a set of guidelines, which was coming straight from the spectral wounds. But then in one of the workshops, Saeed Firdaus, who's an anthropologist in Jahangirnagar University, said, Nainika, you know, there's Persepolis, you can make this into a graphic novel. And I said, no, that will take out 2 years of my life. And it did. And so the film was much more straightforward in terms, not straightforward because there were voice artists and all of that involved, and we didn't have much funding. So 2 voice artists did all the voices, so it's what it is. The multimodal form came from using the slides. You know, there is only movement of the boots and the hand, and then the money stops. So there's no more movement, only the slides move. I drew out aspects of the ethnography which might translate into the graphic novel, and did kind of picture boards along with Kea, and Kea would clarify with me if this is how this is how I was thinking about it, and various. It was really interesting sometimes how her representation and my representation would differ. And we would talk about why she drew the way she had drawn, and we would change some of the representations precisely around the issue of the sex workers. She did not think he should be in a veil. That is the only person in the graphic novel who's in a veil. And I said, she would always meet me in a veil. So it's what she would do. And I would want to retain that idea of how she would meet me outside. So yeah, there is that interaction with various people contributing to the process, and primarily between myself, Kea, and the publishers. It was a WhatsApping triangulation across time zones.
Thank you so much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking, wherever you are, in whatever way is comfortable for you, thanking Professor Nayanika Mookherjee for sharing her work with us and helping us think through these very, very difficult issues. And Professor Menon is joining us for a moment. You just need to turn your...
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thanks so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you for our next event, which is happening soon on Saturday. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.